All right, thanks, Mallory, and hello, everyone. Like Mallory mentioned, my name is Ann Jackson, and I am an analytics evangelist and the founder of Jackson 2. We've since somewhat refined our mission to call ourselves a data analytics consultancy obsessed with helping businesses understand their data. Today, I'm going to be tackling the topic of how organizations thrive when using data and analytics by discussing several principles that data driven organizations employ to create a thriving data culture. And you're in for a treat because instead of 4 steps, I've actually got 12 principles to share with you. Before we get started, there's one question you're likely asking or have been asked. Why should I care about data and analytics? Over the past 5 to 10 years, businesses and business strategy have been fixated on this idea of data. So the real question here is, what's in it for me? And the answer is pretty straightforward. We want our decision making to be objective and to be informed by the data we collect. Everyone universally agrees that having facts, information, and context about something you're going to be making a decision on is desirable. I can't think of a time where I didn't Google or do some research before buying my next major purchase. And so, of course, this idea leads to collecting and analyzing the data that's around us to drive that type of decision making. Take this simple example of a retail store. There is a multitude of information that could be collected. Your customers. Who are they? Where do they live? What do they enjoy spending their time on? Put simply, how can you provide better service for them? Your products. What's selling and what's not? How can you optimize your supply chain? Sales. What are your customers buying? How does the cross section of your customers and products translate into sales? How do promotional activities impact sales? And maybe your marketing efforts. How effective are your coupon campaigns? What about social media? In today's ideal business world, all of this information would be captured digitally with the goal of using it to shape and direct business strategy. But the reality, according to McKinsey, is that 70% of the digital transformation projects happening, like capturing every facet related to customers purchasing your products, fail to reach their stated goals. That means that the majority of projects that revolve around data don't get the payoff they're looking for. The promise of capturing customer purchasing behavior doesn't turn into changing product offerings or increase return on investment. And more specifically, what is actually happening is that businesses are being inundated with massive amounts of data without any increase in the utilization of that information for insights or strategy. But it's not all bad. There are organizations out there that are getting it right. And that's the purpose of my talk today. I'd like to share with you several guiding principles that data-driven organizations follow. These 12 principles aren't meant to be all-inclusive, but they do make up 12 traits and behaviors that I've seen thriving organizations abide by over my career in analytics, spanning from small startups to Fortune 100 corporations. And I hope what you'll notice throughout the next 20 or 30 minutes is that the emphasis isn't entirely on technology and tools, but more inclusive to incorporate culture, people, and process. So let's get started. The first guiding principle I'd like to share is this: know what answers you're looking for. At a glance, this seems pretty obvious. You've got questions or you're in need of answers. In theory, you know what those questions are. But usually this crucial component is lost along the way and often right at the very beginning. Oftentimes, organizations are excited to start using all the data they've collected. Who wouldn't be? They've gone through the process of making sure data is captured, so a logical next step seems like, let's start measuring it. And so they measure everything. And since there is a massive amount of data, they end up with tons of analytics projects designed to measure or describe all facets of the organization. But here's where the problems start. Without knowing why you're measuring things, oftentimes there will be too many measures to make sense of the data. And furthermore, there's the missing element of knowing why you're measuring things to begin with. What are you going to do once you find out what your annual sales number is? What action will you take? Instead, it's important to take a step back and spend time figuring out what answers you're really looking for, and more importantly, what you'll do with those answers once you find them. You don't need to know all the answers you're looking for, but you should have a few as a starting point. Let's go back to our store example. There's so many facets of data collection, but what are the key few we want to start with to derive answers? Here, it's important to take time and break it down a little further, forcing ourselves to focus on some of the different facets. Maybe we decide to start with customers and products. Using just those two subject areas, we can formulate what answers we're trying to find, keeping in mind that they should tie directly to an action we're going to take. For customer, it would probably start with more awareness on who our purchasers are. How old are they? What is their gender? What is their annual income? How many people are in their household? What are their personal interests? Using the answers we find to drive the next big marketing campaign. And for products, it could be something completely different. We want to know what our current on-hand inventory is. Which products do we have too much stock in? Which products take a long time to sell through? How often are our products changing price? What's causing those price changes? Potentially using those answers to refine inventory and select product suppliers. And it's worth mentioning, in some of these scenarios, you're already likely to have an idea of what the answer is. But the key here is to start thinking about what data would be used and how it can be communicated to all members of the business who have an interest. So once you know what you're looking for, it's really important to figure out where those answers come from. Pretty simple. Again, you're likely to have an idea, but odds are that you're oversimplifying the answer. The monthly dashboard, presentation, or spreadsheet that you use to find current answers is likely riddled with underlying manipulation and transformation. The report you're comfortable using to find the answers is actually based on a spreadsheet that an analyst manually creates every month. And the data the analyst is using, it's queried from a database where the analyst applies several layers of business logic. And not only that, the data is enriched with external third-party information. So one of your goals has to be to rationalize the in-between and truly understand where the information you're receiving is coming from. And that's exactly what data-driven organizations do. And not only that, they make it a point to spend time sharing and documenting the outcome. So once you have the what and where documented, a framework is going to start to develop. A framework that's comprised of the core components data-driven organizations make sure they know before starting any analytics project. Along the way of identifying the where, you're going to run into data gaps and quality issues. Data-driven organizations take the time to understand both. So what do I mean by data gaps and poor data quality? Well, I personally define a data gap as something that's missing. You want to measure X, but there's no real way to track it. This can happen when you've got several manual processes for a task, or perhaps you want to measure something less obvious. Think about our retail store. How would you go about measuring the number of daily shoppers? At first glance, it may seem reasonable to measure the number of transactions per day, but as you discuss the topic and get very precise about the answer you're looking for, that can evolve and change. If the answer is how many unique people visit the store every day independent of purchase, you may not have systems in place to measure. Even the task of counting the number of unique customers who purchase on a given day can be daunting. Similarly, you're going to unearth data quality issues. Along the chain of taking data from an application and making it useful for insights, there can be several layers of transformation. You may have migrated systems and need to have built-in processes to standardize product names. Or perhaps you capture addresses and realize that there's no external check for their validity. When gaps or quality issues are uncovered, data-driven organizations take the opportunity to rationalize the problem. This can mean going back to your source systems and enforcing more rigid requirements on data entry. Maybe it means building in new systems to capture the desired data. Or alternatively, it can mean more clearly defining the transformation and rationalization steps that need to happen with data before it becomes intelligence. Now, as we go back to our analytics template, we've got another section to add on, the how. So once the components are in place to understand what to measure, where it comes from, how it's captured, what you need to do to it, data-driven organizations take the time to define roles and ownership, or simply put, the who. Modern analytics strategies in particular tend to originate from the business side, meaning often that IT may be forced to manage a solution they had no say over. Additionally, the lack of roles and ownership results in scenarios where no one knows where truth is, projects never get sign-off, and the infrastructure doesn't get managed. Data-driven organizations define what the different roles are and, more importantly, assign ownership to each of them. As an example, the systems administrator is responsible for managing the hardware. Their job is to make sure that your analytics applications are up and running. They are responsible for ensuring environments are secure. Conversely, their job is not to be the gatekeepers of analytical content, and more than likely it should not be their job to create content or identify the correct data sources needed to facilitate your answers. The job of knowing the right data and likely generating content would fall on someone who I'll call the data translator. This person understands the business and how business processes work with analytics. They'll be the go-to person for defining how data quality gets handled and also for knowing the where and what of what gets measured. The business stakeholder should be the person responsible for defining the audience and who has access to different analytics. They should have an intimate understanding of the metrics that drive the direction of their business unit. When I say metrics and action, they need to be the ones taking action. And it's worth noting that in some analytics environments, it may even be appropriate for them to directly manage who has access to their content. Give them ownership on what they share. This person or group is the primary audience utilizing the content. So roles and ownership fill out the final section of the framework, the who aspect. And with the framework in place, data-driven organizations are now primed to execute on their analytics initiatives. I want to say here that the framework is meant to be flexible. While I think it would be ideal to have everything filled in, oftentimes there will be additions or changes as the project gets started, and that's to be welcomed and expected. The goal is just to have a few nuggets on where you want to go, the direction you want to take. So again, with the 4 aspects of the framework in place, it's time to move on to the fun part, creating analytics products, the execution aspect. So this is where data-driven organizations know that good analytics projects start with best practices. Here, I firmly believe organizations who are succeeding at being data-driven center their strategy on data visualization, the graphical representation of information and data. This is the medium by which data, analytics, and insights will be shared, and often a place that also falls short of achieving its intended goals. Opposed to building something ad hoc or as a one-time pilot, there's time and forethought put into the final project. Data-driven organizations see every new project as an opportunity to instill best practices and use it as a model for how the next project gets done. Especially when organizations are beginning their journey, starting with best practices can really accelerate future initiatives. To me, one of the most critical components to data visualization is choosing the right display to present and explain data. Having the right charts and graphs is essential to ensuring that the data gathered is met with understanding and utility. Best practices means starting with an understanding of which chart best represents how the data should be interpreted. As an example, are you trying to measure a single measure comparatively? Consider a bar chart. Or if you have use a large number when the precise amount needs to be known. A scatter plot's perfect for multiple measures, and a line chart works great for time-based analysis. Where it's going to start getting more sophisticated is when these elements are combined together into a single collection or display. And that's also where visual analytics goes from good to great. A single dashboard can have more impact by tending to core design elements like layout, color, typography, and size. Layout being the art of putting the various graphical elements together, having functional separation between elements, and even navigation and interactivity. Then there's color. Color is likely the single most overused decoration and design component in data displays. Great design recognizes that color holds meaning. Everything from green means good to the utilization of an organization's primary color as a highlight. Using color purposefully also means mindfulness of the absence of color, so that as color is applied, intention has been made to ensure that the data gets seen. Typography. When I say this, I think both font selection and what words get chosen as companions to the dashboard have equal importance. Titles, descriptions, labels, instructions, these can all enhance the experience of analytics. They can fend off questions and improve overall comprehension. And then there's something as simple as size. Knowing the medium of consumption and designing within that constraint. Whether it be a mobile phone or a projector, keeping size in mind ensures that content gets used, gets consumed. So it's the harmony of these elements with the right chart selection that gives your data a voice, that makes sure they're seen and not lost in an overdesigned or chaotic display. It's best practice when these elements become a template to build from and also a direct influence to each additional analytics project. So once best practices have been tended to, it's important to start sharing stories. Data-driven organizations know the importance of sharing stories about the data they're using and the insights they're finding. And I truly think this is a key differentiator. So why do I believe sharing stories is so impactful? First, stories are memorable. Stories take data and numbers and bring them to life. Stories communicate the journey and reason behind analysis. Great stories inform the audience of the key actors, your measures, the key plot points along the way, likely the insights, and the ending, your success, your progress, your newfound awareness. The next benefit of sharing stories, stories inspire others. Like the story of David and Goliath inspires us to tackle seemingly impossible obstacles, the same can hold true for data stories. Stories can create empathy, putting the audience in the shoes of the storyteller, allowing you to walk alongside the storyteller on his or her journey and having more attachment to the outcome. And similarly, great stories allow us to switch out the key actors and plot points to those that matter to us. Sharing data stories becomes a natural template to inspire new analytics projects. And the sharing of stories has a very great side effect, enhancing overall communication and collaboration between silos or different work groups. And if you're wondering how to get started sharing stories, one popular way is to start a monthly analytics meeting. I've also seen great success in sending out newsletters, or probably my favorite, hijacking a town hall and having a quick update on your analytics progress. So now that you know you should be sharing stories, I'd like to move on to a lighter topic, one that reminds us the power of good marketing and sales tactics. Simply stated, analytics done right leaves the audience wanting more. More can take on a lot of meaning, but there's three in particular we're really on the hunt for. First is delivering more insights. Good analytics starts by answering questions and begs for more insights to be found, more precise questions to be asked, or adding on more granular detail to a subject area. Ideally, it also means gathering insights for new subject areas. It should also lead to deeper questions. Instead of monitoring and measuring segregated subject areas, starting to find relationships among them. Deeper questions are also those that veer into the world of data science, where the conversation shifts from what happened to what if this happens. And more will often mean enriching data, trying to fill in those data gaps identified earlier. One key point I'd like to share here, just because you're working on leaving them wanting more does not mean that they can't use the insights and analytics that are already available. By no means should more halt progress, especially given you've gone through the effort to build out the framework before getting started. More relates to future initiatives or enhancements to analytics products. Okay, so you've got them wanting more, and this is where every good salesman or marketer is prepared to deliver them more, and so should you. This means knowing how to grow and how to plan for more people. When you think about growing, it needs to include scaling out your hardware, the infrastructure that supports your data-driven culture. It also means new applications or data assets. As I mentioned before, a common more request may be to have additional data. This can mean constructing data pipelines or focusing on data storage to meet demand. It will almost certainly mean planning for more people. In its most basic sense, you need to ensure you've got an analytics platform that can scale to allow more users. If that means consumers of dashboards and displays, then the hardware powering that platform will likely need to be enhanced. The same could be said of centralized data repositories. With an increased number of users querying or accessing centralized data comes the need to support them. And even if you've got a robust plan for hardware infrastructure, one thing that shouldn't get lost along the way is how new content gets built, delivered, and managed. The same framework that was employed for an initial analytics project needs to be repeated, and care needs to be taken to ensure the right access is given to the right people. And beyond infrastructure and permissions, more people may mean new roles within the organization. After traditional analysis is likely to come the need for data science, a skill set and toolkit that can be dramatically different from mainstream reporting and business intelligence. Knowing how you're going to grow allows for you to avoid derailing progress. So now that we've set the foundation of good analytics and the principles of what makes great execution, it's time to focus on sustainability. It can be all too easy to get overwhelmed by the notion that everything needs to be built and perfected on the first go. And this is where, again, data-driven organizations don't lose sight of this key guiding principle. Analytics is iterative. Thinking of analytics as iterative is crucial. It means that it's a process that can be repeated and one that should be repeated. Data-driven organizations know this. They focus on starting with and connecting the business understanding, layering in the data understanding, taking time to prepare the data and associated analysis, then evaluating the results and deploying. And along this path, it's not uncommon to go back, start over, or repeat the cycle a few times before something is finalized. Think back to our question about the number of customers at our retail store. It took a few passes to get precise about the true answer we're looking for. It should also be commonplace to ask what the end goal is. What is the right solution for the task at hand? Do you need a castle, a robust, multifaceted solution? One that's going to naturally be more complex, take more time, and require more upfront analysis? For an analytics project, this may mean a data warehouse or a dashboard with several features. Or do you need a simple tent? Easy to deploy, purpose-built, and straightforward. Maybe even something you could call an MVP, a minimum viable product, one that over time will turn into the castle or perhaps just the house that the team really needs. Moving on to another topic of sustainment. Just as we all believe in measuring factors that impact business, so too is the importance of measuring utilization and adoption of analytics. Measurement is the key to understanding user behaviors, everything from consumption to creation. It's also key in being able to plan for the delivery of the more that I discussed earlier. It's your first line of defense and knowing how you'll need to scale. There are many ways to measure this aspect, but here are 3 subject areas I recommend focusing on with some key measurements beneath each. First is user engagement. The goal here is to understand adoption of analytics. If your organization has dashboards available to view, how many people, what percentage of employees are aware of it? And then along with that is how often are people logging in? Is it multiple times per day? How many times per month? And then if you've got a robust platform, what type of activity is happening? As an example, many platforms allow users to subscribe to views, create alerts, or use filters. Measuring the type and quantity of these interactions will gauge how widespread adoption is. The next area I'll call utilization. This is more content and data focused, not just the platform itself. Here, the goal is to dig into understanding what things people are looking at. What are they interested in understanding or analyzing? Is there a sales dashboard that 80% of your staff tends to use? Are they accessing that content multiple times a day? These help to shape what the next analytics projects should be. And for environments where there's more emphasis on self-service, where does the data come from that's being used? Here, it's important to measure not only which ones are used most often, but the amount of data sources. Is there data source proliferation, multiple versions of the same source of truth? And another primary one I like to put in this section is the who. Who is building and creating this content? Knowing who the most active users are is going to be vital in shaping your analytics strategy, as you'll soon see. Finally, there's performance. File this section under what the system administrator may be the most interested in. It's a blend of making sure that your end users are served up a great experience, getting what they need when they need it quickly. Of course, uptime comes into play here, ensuring there's uninterrupted service so that when data is needed for a decision, it's available. And last, but certainly not least, using common monitoring techniques to review logs, analyze system alerts, and correct any hardware errors. The last 2 principles I'll be discussing today are focused squarely on culture. First is building champions inside your organization. A champion is someone that is a natural advocate for analytics. Maybe this person is gifted at building out data content or they're great at analysis. Either way, they're a vital part of growing analytics internally. Champions are known for their leadership and evangelism. This means they'll be able to amplify the voice of analytics. They understand the mission and the goal, using data to drive decisions. They know that weaving data and facts into strategy are the competitive edge your organization needs to thrive. Consider that the champions will be the first wave of people who can't wait to share their stories. Their involvement will be key in promoting utilization, adoption, and awareness around analytics initiatives. Through their leadership, they will share successes, problem-solving strategies, and understanding around data. Great champions also act as natural educators and are key to collaboration. They'll become the first line of support for new business members that engage in analytics and ensure that the concept of being data-driven continues to grow. You can build champions by identifying a few key traits. They should be trustworthy and a good listener, demonstrating a commitment to solving problems and being empathetic to others' needs. Once they are identified, continuously work to get them even more connected to analytics projects and more involved in the strategy. And if you're struggling to find your champions, that's the who in the utilization component. Those are the people that are already building content. The last thing data-driven organizations do is celebrate their victories. It's easy to overlook accomplishments and to forget how far you've come. Data-driven organizations build out goals and mark milestones. Consider the analogy of your analytics strategy being going on a long journey and climbing mountains. In a traditional sense, it's easy to see reaching the highest peak as a sign of success, the ultimate victory for reaching the top. But this mindset is flawed. It diminishes the path it took to get there and progress made along the way. Instead of celebrating the moment of ultimate achievement, data-driven organizations mark and celebrate all their successes along the path. Everything from getting started on their first project to their first major breakthrough in growing adoption. They even celebrate some of the low points, the valleys riddled with learnings and refinement. This strategy points directly back to thinking and acting iteratively, ensuring that the organization continues forward with no end in sight, just the constant mission to be data-driven. So bringing it all back together, the 12 guiding principles I've shared naturally fall into three major phases of analytics strategy. First, the foundation. This is where we built the framework of what we're trying to measure, where it comes from, how we're going to rationalize it, and who is going to own, manage, and use it. Then the execution phase. Starting with practices, data-driven organizations create and share stories, leveraging tactics that leave the audience wanting more and backing it up with the know-how to deliver. And finally, the sustain phase, where iteration is the mantra of every project, emphasis is placed on measuring adoption and managing platforms, champions are created, and all victories get celebrated. Thank you for taking time out of your day to hear the 12 guiding principles that data-driven organizations follow. At this time, I'd be happy to answer any questions you may have. So we've got our first question, and it's a pretty good one. What can I do if my analytics project has stalled? So I think this is a great question because it happens quite often at different organizations. So often there's a lot of energy to get started, but as time goes on, energy can fade. If this happens, I'd start first by observing usage. Is the project or dashboard you've built been used? If the answer is no, then you've probably got to face the truth that you may not have the right data in place. You might just not be hitting the mark on what it is they're truly looking for. But if the answer is yes, it's being utilized, then I think it's probably more about sharing stories and getting the success of the project seen. So if you can, I'd find a champion and leverage your marketing skills to sell the success. If you don't have a forum to share stories, make a monthly meeting and start sharing. All right, we've got another question here. So the presenter mentions the use of stories to promote engagement and develop a data-driven culture. Where could I find an example of one of those stories? This would help me think about how I could write a story for my organization. So this is another really good question. And one thing I would think about doing is actually look to journalism. So data has become really popular in the journalism space. You can think about 538 or maybe the Upshot. That's where people are using data to tell stories and crafting really compelling arguments and really making people stop and think. Even when you think about the most recent elections, analytics is weaved throughout. I would start there. There's also a really good I think it's both a presentation and a blog article. This was done by Ben Jones, and he talked about the different types of data stories there are. So you can think about your hero, what kind of journey they're on. So think about phrasing stories in that way and using that as a way to communicate and get sort of the drama that you want in the stories. Okay, so our next question. What are some data and analytics competencies that we should measure our teams and talent against? Yeah, this is a tough one, especially when I think about data and analytics right now. There's this sense that everybody's got to be good at everything. So for me, analytics competency, break it down to a couple of different roles and kind of personas. So for the business stakeholder, the person who's just using data to inform their decisions, your best line to measure that is going to be the utilization aspect. So I'd say not only how often are they accessing tools, but how many tools do they have available? And I'd even say how often are they asking for more tools? Hopefully, ideally, the metrics that you've got, the things that you're measuring, how you're using data is ingrained into um, organiz- organizational strategy, so strategic things that the organization's trying to achieve. So that would be another good aspect. When I think about data and analytics competency for those data translators, the people that are creating content, for them, it's both a blend of the technical, but it's really, I think, more on communicating, sharing those stories, and really translating the wants of the business to what the data is. So that business understanding to data understanding. A little bit harder to measure, but some of that really comes with, again, how much are people actually using the stuff that's been built? Are they coming back and asking for more? All right, our next question. Should a larger data initiative always involve a plan for a data warehouse? Will that prevent issues further down the road with using multiple data sources over time? Oh, Jason, this is a good question. So, um, should a larger data initiative always involve a plan for a data warehouse? Maybe. I don't think that any major data initiative needs to start with a data warehouse. A data warehouse is a really great ideal where you have a place where all the data is rationalized, it's clean, it's stored, it's beautifully presented inside the warehouse. But the reality that I've seen a lot of times is that the warehouse is missing components or people don't know it exists. It doesn't quite have what people are looking for. So I tend to believe that a great first start with analytics projects and initiatives is get to the data as close as you can to the raw application without any of that transformation. Really understand those data quality gaps, that any issues that are there, and use that as a guide to what the future may bring. Now, I will say there are some realizations where you may need a data warehouse or a place, we'll just call it a home for your data to live. If you have that third party data, if you're consuming it from the web, if you're using a lot of APIs, it may be necessary for you to have a place that your data can live. But I don't think it's ever a requirement for any project. Your second question, will it prevent issues further down the road with using multiple data sources over time? Yes, potentially for sure. Particularly when you think about a data warehouse, think about all of those additional components that go in there of rationalizing something like, how do I take what my customer ID is with my sales and marry that up with the social media activity that they're doing or with a loyalty card? Some of those things that a data warehouse can capture can prevent downstream effects of having those multiple data sources. Okay, next question. How can you transform legacy boring data to friendly and exciting an excited data central point to visit? Sorry, I kind of botched that, but essentially, how can you take legacy analytics and make it fun and exciting? So this is where I think design and best practices have a big home, and also personalizing it. So thinking back to the story aspect, how can you make it mean something to the person who's going to use it? Some really successful ways to do that beyond taking numbers and turning them into charts and graphs is think about a sales associate, right? Instead of saying, here's the sales numbers for the month, personalize it to them. Here is your sales card, your sales scorecard for the month. And by the way, here's how you stack up to your peers on the same team. I guarantee that if you go about it with that sort of gamification mindset, if you personalize it to the consumer, that they're really going to want to go there. In terms of making people visit that centralized place, that's a lot about communication. It's continually sharing back that message and pointing people in that one centralized place. Soon it's going to be sort of natural that everyone goes there, but it's definitely going to be the case early on that you're going to have to continuously guide and communicate that this is the place that you need to go. All right, our next question. How can I get executives to buy in on analytics projects? This is a good one. I would love it if you had sort of top-down buy-in, or in the process that you had an executive that already loved analytics and saw the innate value in it. But if that's not true, that's where it's really critical that whatever analytics is being developed points back to their strategic goals. a lot of times what this really looks like is making sure that what you're building has a numeric value associated with it. If you are building a dashboard or you're doing exploratory analysis to optimize your supply chain, you need to quantify what that optimization is. Hey, we saved X percent on this. We reduced our vendor number by Y percent. You've got to make it tangible for them to understand the benefits. Sometimes it can be hard when you get started for people to understand that. There are some people that it's just ingrained in them. It's really obvious, like, hey, I get the value of this, but for others, you really need to spell it out. And so that's what I would really start to do there. And really, I'd say point to some other organizations doing good work. Okay. Another question here. If an organization is new to collecting data, should they collect all possible data to begin with, store it in a data warehouse, and then worry about turning that into valuable information? What do you suggest for similar use cases? Okay, so if you are fortunate enough to collect all the data and have a really nice data warehouse, I don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with having that in place. I think it's probably a little bit unrealistic. Most organizations I work with have a data warehouse that they've tried to implement, or they have a couple data marts, or they still have data locked away in separate applications. So I don't think it's necessarily bad to collect all of that data, but certainly if you're asking yourself, hey, should I construct one more data pipeline to put more in the data warehouse versus, hey, maybe we should start analyzing the data that we actually have? The answer I'm going to give you is analyze. Go look at the data itself. That's always a better place to start. That's the goal of what you're doing. That's the purpose of capturing the data. So just make sure you don't lose sight of that. So I have one more question here, which is, how many people do you think it takes to get started on this process? This one as well, I like, because as I listed out the roles, you may be thinking there needs to be an army of people involved, and that's not necessarily true. I mentioned I've worked with startups and larger organizations, so this works for any size. So for smaller organizations, or maybe during initial phases of getting started, I don't think it's uncommon for someone to wear multiple hats. The business stakeholder may also be the data translator, or maybe you have something that's really adept, a consultant or someone who you can identify to be sort of like that champion to get started. That person can wear a lot of those hats early on. But what I will say is that as analytics grows inside your organization, it should become the case that there are multiple people to help keep everything going. That kind of points back to the upkeep, the maintenance aspect, right? It's unrealistic to think that one person can manage all of the analytics by themselves. That keeps it segregated from other people getting the benefit, and it really diminishes probably what that person is capable of. So it's really important, I think, to at least have a plan in place to get some of those roles put into separate buckets, right? And it can mean, future down the line that maybe, I mentioned that the business usually starts analytics projects and then IT takes it over. Make that IT takeover a little bit less stressful and painful by having a transition process in place and knowing when it's the right time for IT to sort of maintain the hardware, the architecture, everything that you've been working to achieve. All right. And we've got one last question, which is, what if managers want more analytics, but they won't invest in the infrastructure needed? So we've kind of been talking about this in a couple different ways. And I really do think it's a common problem. There's people interested in analytics, but not necessarily the investment to execute it well. So this is where building that tent can be helpful at first. I mentioned this before. Start with the source system. Start with something initial. And really make that initial build, whatever that is, something that people can't live without. Make it frustratingly difficult for them to see a future where they can't have the number that you're giving them, the tool that you've given them. Ideally, that's going to help justify the investment. And again, continue to share those stories and link it back to your organizational goals. I will say that as you go down this path, it's critical that you're realistic about limitations. Know your architecture, know your platform really well, know what it's good at, know what you need to outsource to another piece of technology. Technology's come a long way, so it's really easy to mix and match the right tools for the right job. It's just being aware that you need those functional elements in place to be successful. Okay.
Thank you so much, Anne. That was a great presentation, and thank you for taking the time to answer all those questions. As we wrap up, is there any final thoughts that you wanted to share?
The what I'd love to share is the best thing to do with analytics is just get started. Know that there's these guiding principles out there. I'd say keep it in a really positive light and don't let curiosity get the better of you. Make that part of the exploration and the adventure. There's always going to be a sense of wanting more. You just need to make sure that you take that more and funnel that energy into new initiatives, more to come.